The coffee was still steaming when Matteo Conti found the note beneath it. He almost didn't see it. A single folded sheet of paper, tucked so precisely under the saucer that it looked deliberate, almost defiant. For a man who controlled shipping routes across 3 countries, who had men twice her size flinch at the sound of his footsteps, it was a strange thing to feel his hand pause mid-reach. But that came later. First, there was the morning before. Nora Bianchi had been awake since 4 a.m., not because anyone told her to be, but because sleep had never come easily in a house that hated her before she'd even unpacked her bags. She'd arrived at the Conti estate the previous afternoon with a single suitcase and a letter of reference from an employment agency that specialized in discreet domestic placements. A polite way of saying nobody asked too many questions about where the money came from. She needed the job. Her savings had run dry 6 months ago, after the accounting firm where she'd worked for 9 years decided a woman her size didn't fit the client-facing image they wanted for their newly renovated Milan office. 9 years of flawless audits, erased by a dress size. She told herself the humiliation ended there. She was wrong. Matteo Conti met her in the marble foyer of his coastal estate, wearing an expression she would later learn was his default. Cold, assessing, faintly bored, as if the world existed to disappoint him and rarely surprised him by failing to. "This is the new one?" he asked, not looking at her, speaking instead to Enzo, the house manager who had brought her in. "Yes, Signor Conti." "Nora Bianchi." Matteo turned then, and his eyes moved over her, the way a customs officer inspects a suspicious package. Slow, clinical, unkind. "Christ," he muttered. "Did the agency run out of actual maids?" Nora's spine stiffened, but she said nothing. She had learned, in 9 years of quiet professional cruelty, that silence cost her nothing and gave them nothing to enjoy. It only seemed to irritate him further. "Do you understand Italian? English? Anything?" He clicked his fingers, as if she were a dog failing to fetch. "My study. Now. Let's see if you can at least hold a broom without knocking over the furniture." He led her, or rather, stalked ahead of her, forcing her to half-jog to keep pace through the long marble corridors, until they reached a heavy oak door. Inside was a study that looked less like a workspace and more like the site of a controlled explosion. Papers were piled on every surface, invoices, shipping manifests, ledgers with pages dog-eared and coffee-stained, all shoved into drawers that no longer closed properly. Matteo swept his arm across the nearest stack, and a full year of documents cascaded to the floor in a papery avalanche. "Clean this," he said. "All of it. I want this room spotless by morning, and I don't want to hear a single complaint, because unlike you, this business doesn't have the luxury of falling apart." He left without another word. The door shut with a finality that rattled the window panes. Nora stood alone in the wreckage for a long moment. Then, quietly, she began to pick up the papers. It should have taken her the whole night just to organize them into neat, meaningless stacks. That was clearly all he expected, a symbolic punishment, an exercise designed to remind her of her place before she'd even started. But Nora Bianchi had spent 9 years reading numbers the way other people read faces. And as she sorted the shipping manifests by date, something in the pattern snagged at her, the way a loose thread catches on a fingernail. She sat down on the cold marble floor at nearly 1 in the morning, spreading 3 months of invoices in front of her like a hand of cards, and she saw it. A shipping route to Tunis, logged twice under 2 different account codes, a handling fee that appeared on the books, but matched no vendor Matteo's own company had ever contracted. Numbers that were almost right. close enough to survive a lazy glance, wrong enough to bleed money quietly, invisibly, month after month. By 3 a.m., she wasn't sorting papers anymore. She was auditing. By 5, she had traced it as far as she could without further access. Nearly 2 million euros, siphoned out of Matteo Conti's legitimate shipping accounts over the better part of a year, dressed up in language boring enough that no one would ever think to question it. She could have said nothing. She could have finished stacking the papers, kept her head down, and collected her modest salary in blessed obscurity. It would have been the safe thing to do. Instead, at 6 a.m., with the sun barely touching the edge of the sea outside the study window, Nora took a single clean sheet of paper and wrote, in small, careful handwriting, exactly what she'd found: the dates, the discrepancy, the pattern, the number circled twice for emphasis. No apology. No flourish. Just the truth, laid out the way she used to present it to men in tailored suits who'd never once thanked her for saving their careers. She left it on his breakfast tray, tucked beneath the saucer of his morning coffee, and returned to her quarters before the house fully woke. Matteo unfolded the note with the same irritation he brought to everything that morning until he read the first line: 2 million in unaccounted losses, route falsification, entry-level manipulation, ongoing, NB. His coffee went cold on the table. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Matteo Conti read something twice. Somewhere in his house, cleaning a bathroom she'd been told needed to shine, or else, the maid he'd humiliated 12 hours earlier had just handed him the first thread of a conspiracy that would eventually threaten everything he owned. He had no idea yet how much further that thread would unravel. Matteo didn't mention the note for 3 days. Nora noticed the silence more than she would have noticed a confrontation. He watched her now. She felt it, in the particular way a room seemed to hold its breath whenever he entered while she was working. He said nothing about the 2 million euros. He didn't thank her, didn't apologize for the papers he'd thrown at her feet, didn't acknowledge that a woman he'd called unfit to hold a broom had just handed him proof that someone inside his own organization was bleeding him dry. But on the 4th morning, he told Enzo to bring her to the docks. Housekeeping was the word he used, flat and dismissive, as if the assignment meant nothing. The office at the port needs cleaning. Take her. Nora said nothing. She had learned that lesson well. The Naples shipping docks were nothing like the quiet elegance of the coastal estate. Here, the Conti business breathed in a different rhythm, forklifts groaning under crates, men shouting over the horn blasts of departing freighters, the sharp tang of diesel and salt water thick in the air. At the center of it all sat a squat administrative building with Matteo's private suite on the top floor, and beneath it, a bullpen of accountants hunched over desks, stacked with invoices. Nora was given a cart, a set of cleaning supplies, and instructions to stay out of the way. She stayed out of the way for exactly 40 minutes. She was dusting the bookshelves in Matteo's private suite, a glass-walled office that overlooked the accounting floor below like a fishbowl, when she noticed the 2 men working directly beneath him. One was young, nervous, constantly glancing at the door. The other was older, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, the kind of calm that came from doing something wrong so many times it no longer registered as wrong. She watched them for a while, pretending to polish a shelf that was already spotless. The older man was filing invoices, but not in the order they arrived. He was matching shipment numbers to purchase orders that didn't correspond to the same week, sliding a February invoice into a March folder, a March invoice into a February one. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing that would only ever be caught by someone who actually read the numbers instead of simply filing them. It was, Nora realized with a small jolt, precisely the kind of manipulation she'd found buried in Mateo's ledgers 3 nights ago. She didn't say anything to the accountants. She wasn't foolish enough for that. Instead, when Mateo returned to his office an hour later, visibly irritated by a phone call that had clearly gone badly, she was dusting the window that overlooked the floor below. "You're still here," he said, more statement than question. "I am, Signor Conti." He moved to his desk, shuffling through a stack of reports with the distracted energy of a man carrying too many problems at once. Nora hesitated only a moment before she spoke. Not loudly, not with any performance of confidence, just quietly enough that he'd have to actually listen to hear her. "The invoices are being filed out of sequence. On purpose." Mateo's hand stilled over the papers. He looked up slowly. "What?" "Down there." She nodded toward the glass, toward the older accountant still hunched over his desk, oblivious. "He's matching shipment numbers to the wrong month. It's small enough that no one checks it twice, but it means the numbers never quite line up when someone tries to trace them back. It's the same pattern I found in your ledgers." For a long moment, Mateo said nothing. He simply stared at her, not with the contempt of their first meeting, but with something closer to disbelief, like a man recalculating a math problem he'd been certain he'd already solved. "You can see that, from here, through glass. I've spent 9 years reading numbers people didn't want me to read," Nora said simply. "It's not so different from reading faces. You learn what's being hidden by what's being overemphasized." Mateo walked to the window and stood beside her, looking down at the accounting floor with new eyes, eyes that were, for the first time, actually suspicious of the men he'd trusted with his money for years. He studied the older accountant's movements, the careful, practiced rhythm of a man who had done this so many times, it no longer felt like theft to him. "That's Gianni," Mateo said quietly. "He's worked for my family for 11 years. "Then he's very good at what he's doing," Nora said. "Whoever taught him didn't just teach him to steal. They taught him to be patient. That's not 11 years of one man's greed, Signor Conti. That takes someone directing it from higher up, someone protecting him." The words landed heavier than Nora intended. She watched something shift behind Mateo's eyes. Not shock exactly, but a colder, more dangerous kind of understanding. He wasn't looking at a lone thief anymore. He was looking at a structure, a hierarchy of betrayal, reaching further into his organization than he'd wanted to imagine. "Someone inside my own circle," he said, almost to himself. "I can't tell you who," Nora said carefully. "Not from what I've seen. But I can tell you it's not one man acting alone. The pattern's too clean for that." Mateo turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his estate, there was no contempt in his expression at all, only a sharp, calculating focus, the look of a man who had just realized the maid he'd humiliated might be the only person in his entire organization he could actually trust. "Finish the windows," he said finally, voice low. "Then come back to my office. We're going to talk." Nora nodded, and as she returned to her cart, she felt the quiet, dangerous weight of a door swinging open, one she suspected neither of them could close again. 2 weeks passed before Mateo said the word Capri out loud, and when he did, it wasn't an invitation, it was an order. "You're coming with us," he told Nora, not looking up from the shirt cuffs he was fastening in the hallway mirror. "Valeria's charity gala. You'll manage the suite. Luggage, logistics, whatever she needs. Try not to be noticed." Nora had learned enough about Matteo Conti in 14 days to understand that this wasn't cruelty anymore. Not exactly. It was caution. Since the conversation in his glass-walled office, he'd quietly begun testing her. Small tasks, disguised as chores. each one a little closer to the center of his business than the last. Reviewing petty cash logs, cross-checking a fuel invoice, watching, always watching, to see if her instincts about Gianni had been a fluke or a gift. She hadn't been wrong once, but Capri wasn't business. Capri was Valeria's world, and Nora understood within an hour of arriving at the Grand Hotel Imperial exactly how small she was meant to feel in it. The hotel suite alone was larger than Nora's apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the turquoise curve of the Marina Piccola, gold fixtures, a private terrace where waiters delivered champagne no one had ordered, simply because it seemed like the kind of place where champagne should always be flowing. Nora spent the afternoon unpacking garment bags, pressing an evening gown that cost more than she'd earned in the last 3 months combined, and steaming the collar of a tuxedo jacket while trying to stay invisible in the flurry of hotel staff and stylists. Valeria Ricci arrived like weather, a storm dressed in emerald silk, trailing 2 assistants and a cloud of expensive perfume. She was beautiful in the deliberate, engineered way of someone who had spent a lifetime being told beauty was the only currency that mattered, and she carried herself like a woman accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her presence. She noticed Nora almost immediately. "Who is this?" Valeria asked, not to Nora, but to the room in general, as if Nora were a piece of furniture that had been placed somewhere inconvenient. "The new house staff," Matteo said, distracted, adjusting his cufflinks. Valeria's eyes swept over Nora slowly, the same clinical, assessing look Matteo himself had once given her, except sharpened by something crueler, something that enjoyed the cruelty rather than simply defaulting to it. "God, Matteo, where do you find these people? Does the agency not have a minimum standard anymore?" She laughed, a bright, brittle sound. "Honestly, darling, she's going to be photographed carrying my bags. Can you imagine the headlines? At least hire someone who won't embarrass us both." A few of the hotel staff nearby exchanged glances and looked away, the particular awkward silence of people who wanted no part of what was happening, but weren't brave enough to stop it. Nora kept folding the tuxedo jacket. Her hands didn't shake. She had absorbed worse from people who mattered less, and she'd learned that giving Valeria a reaction was the only thing that could make the humiliation worse. "That's enough," Matteo said. The words weren't loud, but something in his voice cut through the room like a dropped glass. Valeria blinked, clearly startled. This was not a script she'd rehearsed. "Excuse me?" "I said that's enough." Matteo crossed the room, positioning himself with unmistakable intent between Valeria and where Nora stood. "She works for me. She's good at her job. You don't get to talk to my staff like that in my suite." "Your staff," Valeria repeated, incredulous, "is not the point, Matteo. My reputation." "Your reputation isn't her responsibility to protect," he said flatly. "Go finish getting ready. The gala starts in an hour." Valeria stared at him for a long moment, something calculating flickering behind her irritation, as if she were recalculating the terms of an arrangement she'd always assumed was settled. Then, without another word, she turned and swept into the bedroom, her assistants scurrying after her. The silence she left behind was almost louder than she had been. Nora didn't look at Matteo. She focused very deliberately on the jacket in her hands, folding it with more precision than it required, giving her fingers something to do besides betray how much the moment had shaken her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know." Matteo's voice had lost its edge, gone rougher, almost tired. "I did it anyway." He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to. The gala unfolded below them for hours. Nora caught glimpses of it from the terrace, chandeliers and orchestras, and a sea of designer gowns. Matteo moving through the crowd, with Valeria on his arm, playing the role expected of him with practiced, hollow charm. It was nearly 1 in the morning when he returned to the suite alone, his tie loosened, his expression heavy with something Nora hadn't seen on him before. Not the cold authority of their first meeting, not the sharp calculation of the docs, but something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man performing a life he no longer wanted. He found her still awake, organizing the last of the paperwork he'd brought with him, out of habit more than instruction. "I need you to see something," he said, and there was no command in it this time, only request, quiet and almost uncertain. He set a heavy leather ledger on the table between them, the kind of book that clearly hadn't left a locked drawer in years. "This is everything, the real numbers, not the ones Gianni files, the master accounts." Nora looked up at him, understanding settling over her slowly, weighted and undeniable. "You're bringing me into your business," she said. "Your actual business. I'm bringing you into the only part of my life I still trust," Matteo said, and for the first time since she'd arrived at his estate, he didn't sound like a man giving an order. He sounded like a man asking for help, and admitting, in the quiet of a hotel suite 2 weeks after calling her unfit to hold a broom, that he had nowhere else left to turn. They worked through the master ledgers for 3 nights straight, and by the third, Nora had stopped thinking of Matteo Conti as a stranger who once threw papers at her feet. His private study had become something else entirely, no longer a room of punishment, but a shared battlefield, littered with printouts and coffee cups, and the particular electric silence of 2 people chasing the same thread. Matteo had cleared his schedule of everything he could, canceling meetings with an irritation that used to be reserved for people who wasted his time. Now he sat across from Nora at 2 in the morning, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching her trace numbers with the same intensity most men reserved for something far more dangerous. "Here," Nora said on the 3rd night, turning the master ledger toward him and tapping a column of transfers with the end of her pen. "This account. It's listed under Meridian Holdings, supposedly one of your logistics subsidiaries." "It is one of my subsidiaries," Matteo said. "No," Nora said carefully. "It was. 3 years ago. It was dissolved after the Palermo route restructuring. I found the closure filing buried in your archive folder an hour ago, but money is still moving into it. Every month, smaller amounts than the Tunis discrepancy, but steady. And it's not staying in Meridian's account. It's routing out again within 48 hours, every single time, to an offshore account in the Caymans." Matteo leaned over the desk, studying the trail she'd built across 3 sheets of paper, arrows connecting numbers that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. "Whose name is on the Cayman account?" Nora's throat tightened before she answered. She'd found this an hour before he'd arrived, and she'd read it 4 times, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into something less dangerous. "Yours," she said quietly. "Matteo Conti, not the company." "You, personally?" The room went very still. "That's not possible," Matteo said, but his voice had lost its certainty even as he spoke the words. "I've never opened an account in the Caymans in my life." "I know," Nora said. "That's what makes this so much worse than simple theft. Whoever set this up wasn't trying to steal from you quietly. They were building a paper trail, a very convincing one, that makes it look like you're the one hiding money offshore. Structured deposits under the reporting threshold, funneled through a dead subsidiary, landing in an account with your name on it." She looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate, she saw real fear behind his composure. "Signor Conti, this isn't embezzlement. This is a frame. Someone is building a case against you. If the wrong people ever looked at these books, federal investigators, tax authorities, this would look exactly like willful, deliberate fraud. Your fraud. Mateo sat back slowly, running a hand down his face. How long? 14 months, Nora said. Whoever's doing this has been patient, careful. This isn't a low-level accountant panicking and skimming what he can. This took planning, access to your signature, your personal documents, enough authority to move real subsidiary structures around without anyone questioning it. That's not Gianni, Mateo said quietly. He doesn't have that kind of access. No, Nora agreed. It's someone above him. Someone who could order him to misfile those invoices and know he wouldn't ask why. Neither of them said the name out loud, but Nora watched it settle behind Mateo's eyes anyway. The shape of a suspicion he clearly didn't want to hold, forming despite himself. They were so deep into tracing the IP addresses behind the Cayman transfers, cross-referencing login timestamps against travel records, trying to catch whoever was accessing the account remotely, that neither of them heard the study door open. Working late, cousin? Silvio Moretti filled the doorway the way he filled every room he entered. Broad-shouldered, unhurried, wearing the easy, watchful smile of a man who had spent 20 years as Mateo's underboss and trusted advisor. His eyes moved from Mateo to Nora to the scattered papers on the desk with a casualness that didn't quite reach his gaze. Nora's stomach dropped, but her hands moved before her fear could catch up with her, sweeping the master ledger and the Cayman printouts into the drawer beside her in one fluid motion, grabbing the nearest cloth from her cart and dropping to one knee beside the desk as if she'd simply been scrubbing a mark from the floor. "Apologies, Signor Moretti," she murmured, not looking up, keeping her voice small and unremarkable. "Signor Conti asked me to finish the floors before I retired for the night." Silvio's gaze lingered on her a beat too long before shifting back to Mateo. "Since when do you supervise the cleaning staff personally, Mateo?" "Since I got tired of finding streaks on my windows," Mateo said, and the lie came so smoothly, so effortlessly, that Nora felt a flicker of surprise at how easily he'd matched her performance. He leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom with practiced ease. "What do you need, Silvio? It's late. Nothing urgent." Silvio's eyes drifted once more toward the drawer where Nora had hidden the ledger, and for a moment, Nora was certain he'd seen something. "Just checking on you. You've seemed distracted lately. Distant. I've had a lot on my plate," Mateo said. Clearly, Silvio's smile didn't move, but something behind it sharpened. "Get some rest, cousin. You look tired." His gaze flicked to Nora one final time. Not suspicious exactly, but assessing, filing her away for later consideration, before he finally withdrew, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The silence that followed felt different than before. Heavier. Dangerous. "He saw something," Nora whispered. "Maybe." Mateo's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the closed door. Or maybe he's just doing what he always does, watching everyone, all the time, for exactly this reason. He turned back to Nora slowly, and the trust in his expression had curdled into something colder, more focused. "We need somewhere safer than this house," he said. "Starting tomorrow." They left before sunrise. Mateo told the estate staff, and, more carefully, Silvio, that he was overseeing a restoration project on a family property in Sicily, an old villa his grandfather had left to rot for decades. It wasn't entirely a lie. The villa existed. It did need restoring. It simply also happened to be the only place within 100 miles where Mateo was certain no one was currently stealing from him. Nora rode in the back of the car with the master ledgers hidden inside a stack of ordinary moving boxes, her heart hammering the entire 2-hour drive south, certain that every car behind them belonged to Silvio. The villa sat on a hillside above the Sicilian coast, half swallowed by overgrown olive groves, its stone walls cracked and sun-bleached, shutters hanging loose on rusted hinges. It looked abandoned. That was precisely the point. "It's not much," Matteo said, watching her take in the peeling plaster and dust-covered furniture as they carried the boxes inside. "It's honest," Nora said, and meant it. After weeks of marble floors and gold fixtures that hid rot underneath, there was something almost restful about a house that looked exactly as broken as it was. They spent the first days in a strange, quiet rhythm, clearing out one wing of the villa to serve as a workspace, running extension cords to power laptops in a room that had no working outlets, sleeping in shifts because neither of them fully trusted the silence around them yet. Matteo hired 2 men he'd known since childhood, men whose loyalty predated Silvio's influence entirely, to watch the perimeter roads. Beyond that, it was just the 2 of them and the numbers. It was the 12th night at the villa when the walls between them started coming down. They'd been tracing a dead-end IP address for hours, and Matteo had finally given up, pushing back from the desk and rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. Outside, the cicadas had gone quiet, and the only light in the room came from a single lamp and the blue glow of the laptop screen. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and there was none of the command in his voice that she remembered from their first meeting. "That first morning, when I threw those papers at you, why didn't you just quit?" Nora considered the question longer than it probably deserved. "Because I needed the job," she said honestly. "But that's not the whole answer." She turned her chair slightly to face him. "I spent 9 years at an accounting firm in Milan. I was good at what I did, genuinely good, the kind of good that got me promoted twice in 5 years. And then a new partner joined the firm, and in my first review with him, he told me I was brilliant, but that clients found it distracting to work with someone my size in client-facing meetings. They moved me to a back office, cut my visibility, then my bonuses, then eventually just cut me entirely, and called it restructuring." Matteo was quiet, watching her with an attention she wasn't used to receiving. "So when you threw those papers at me," Nora continued, "it didn't feel that different from what I'd already survived. Cruelty from powerful men wasn't new. I decided a long time ago that the only thing I could control was whether I let it define what I did with my hands and my mind. So I cleaned the floor, and then I did what I actually know how to do." "You could have just cleaned the floor," Matteo said quietly. "No one would have blamed you for leaving the rest." "I know," Nora said, "but I was tired of being underestimated by men who never bothered to actually look at what I could do. I wanted you to see it, even if you never said thank you." Matteo let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I never did say thank you, did I?" "No," Nora said. "You didn't. I'm saying it now." His voice had dropped, quieter, more careful than she'd ever heard it. "Thank you, Nora, for that first morning, for the docs, for not walking away when Silvio walked in." She didn't quite know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched, comfortable in a way it had never been before. "Can I ask you something now?" she said finally. Matteo nodded. "Why do you carry all of this yourself? The business, the family, Silvio, Valeria, all of it. You didn't build this world. You inherited it. You could have walked away from it entirely." Something shifted in Matteo's face, old grief surfacing beneath the composure he wore like armor. "My father died when I was 26, he said. "He didn't give me a choice about inheriting this. He gave me a funeral and 300 men who expected me to lead them the next morning. I've spent 8 years being what everyone needed me to be. Ruthless enough for the men who worked for me, respectable enough for people like Valeria's family, cold enough that no one ever thought to test me. He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression. I don't think anyone's asked me what I actually wanted in a very long time. "What do you want?" Nora asked softly. Matteo didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he hadn't on that first morning, when his eyes had swept over her with contempt. Now there was something else entirely in his gaze, something that made her breath catch despite herself. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not dreading finding out." Outside, the cicadas started up again, and neither of them moved to break the silence that settled comfortably between them. Two people, worlds apart in every way that should have mattered, finding something neither of them had expected in the ruins of an old villa and the wreckage of a stolen fortune. 3 weeks into the villa's quiet rhythm, Nora offered to make the supply run into town herself. It was a small thing. Matteo's men usually handled it, but they'd been stretched thin watching the perimeter roads, and Nora welcomed the excuse to feel like an ordinary person again, even for an hour. She drove the old pickup truck down the winding hillside roads to the village market, a cluster of stone buildings and awning-covered stalls that smelled of ripe tomatoes and fresh bread, and let herself enjoy the ordinary business of buying vegetables and olive oil like the world outside the villa wasn't quietly unraveling. She was standing at a stall choosing lemons when a voice behind her made her blood run cold. "You're a long way from Naples, Signorina Bianchi." Nora turned slowly. Silvio Moretti stood a few feet away, dressed casually in a way that somehow made him more unsettling than his usual tailored suits, as if he'd made an effort to look like he simply happened to be there, an effort that didn't fool her for a second. Two men she didn't recognize stood near a parked car at the edge of the square, close enough to matter, far enough to look incidental. "Signor Moretti." She kept her voice level, forced her hands to stay steady around the bag of lemons. "What a surprise. Is it?" His smile was warm, easy, the same practiced charm she'd seen him use on Matteo, and it made her skin crawl precisely because she now understood what that charm concealed. "I have business in Messina. I heard rumors that Matteo was restoring some old ruin nearby. Imagine my surprise to hear his new housekeeper had come along for the renovation." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, the pleasant mask never slipping, even as the words underneath it turned sharp. "You've been very busy, Nora, working late hours, reviewing documents that aren't exactly within a maid's job description." "I clean whatever room I'm asked to clean," Nora said carefully, "including the study." "Of course." Silvio's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite amusement. "Let's not waste each other's time, shall we? You're clever. I've watched you long enough to know that. Clever enough to see patterns most people would miss. Clever enough that Matteo started trusting you with things he shouldn't trust anyone with." He glanced briefly at the men by the car, then back to her. "I have a proposal. A generous one. 200,000 euros, deposited wherever you like, no questions asked. In exchange, you stop auditing anything that isn't a bathroom floor, and you leave the country by the end of the week. Go back to Milan. Start over somewhere no one knows your name." Nora's pulse hammered, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, the same blank composure she'd learned to wear in 9 years of boardrooms that wanted her invisible. "That's a strange offer for a man who has nothing to hide, Signor Moretti." Something flickered behind Silvio's eyes, brief, cold, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm offering you a chance to walk away from something that's about to become very dangerous. Matteo's business is complicated. People who involve themselves too deeply in complicated business have a tendency to get hurt. I'd hate for that to happen to someone as talented as you. The threat sat beneath the pleasant words, like a blade beneath silk, and Nora understood, with sudden and total clarity, that she was looking directly at the man responsible for the Cayman accounts, the misfiled invoices, the entire architecture of Mateo's frame-up. He hadn't come here to bribe a housekeeper. He'd come to eliminate a threat before it fully understood what it had found. She thought of 9 years of men underestimating her. She thought of the note she'd left under Mateo's coffee cup, the first blow she'd struck against a system built to keep her small and quiet. She was not going to hand this man the satisfaction of watching her fold. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear pounding beneath her ribs. "But I think I'll stay and finish my work, Signor Moretti. Signor Conti pays well, and I've grown fond of the coastline." For a moment, something dangerous moved behind Silvio's easy smile, a flash of the man beneath the charm, calculating, cold, unaccustomed to being refused. Then it vanished, smoothed over as quickly as it had appeared. "A shame," he said lightly. "Well, enjoy the lemons." He turned and walked back toward his car without another word, his two companions falling into step behind him, and within moments the vehicle was gone, disappearing down the coastal road as though the conversation had never happened. Nora stood frozen in the market square for a long moment, her heart still racing, the bag of lemons forgotten in her white-knuckled grip. She had her confirmation now, not just suspicion, not just a pattern in the numbers, but the man himself, standing in front of her, threatening her into silence. She drove back to the villa faster than the winding roads probably allowed, and found Mateo in the study, poring over shipping manifests by lamplight. He looked up the moment she entered, some instinct immediately reading the tension in her face. What happened? "Silvio was in the village," Nora said, setting the grocery bags down with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking. "He offered me 200,000 euros to stop auditing your books and leave the country by the end of the week." Mateo went very still. And I told him I liked the coastline." For a moment, something like fear passed across Mateo's face. Not for himself, she realized, but for her, sharp and immediate and entirely unguarded. Then it hardened into something colder, more resolute. "He wouldn't have come himself," Mateo said quietly, standing, crossing the room to her. "Not for a simple bribe. He's protecting something bigger than money, and he's scared enough of what you've found to threaten you directly. It's him," Nora said, the words settling heavily in the quiet room, months of suspicion finally collapsing into certainty. "Mateo, it's Silvio. It's been Silvio this entire time." Valeria arrived at the villa 4 days later, unannounced, in a car that clearly wasn't built for the gravel roads leading up the hillside, and stepped out onto the dust in heels that sank into the earth with every furious step she took toward the door. Nora saw her first, through the study window, and felt her stomach drop. "Mateo." She kept her voice low, urgent. "Valeria's here." Mateo swore under his breath, and was already moving toward the entrance by the time the pounding started on the heavy wooden door. He opened it to find Valeria standing on the threshold, arms crossed, her expression a carefully constructed mixture of hurt and outrage that Nora suspected had been rehearsed the entire drive down from Naples. "Do you have any idea," Valeria said, not bothering with a greeting, "how it looks that my fiancé has been hiding in some crumbling ruin for over a month? People are talking, Mateo. The Sabatini wedding is in 6 weeks, and I need you in Naples, not playing house in Sicily with the maid." The last word landed with deliberate cruelty, aimed as much at Nora, standing quietly near the study doorway, as it was at the situation itself. "I've been dealing with a business matter," Matteo said, his voice tight, controlled. "One that requires privacy. A business matter." Valeria's laugh was sharp, disbelieving. "I've spoken to my father. He's spoken to the Moretti family. Everyone is asking why you've disappeared, why Silvio's been managing meetings you should be attending, why the wedding preparations have stalled while you renovate a house nobody asked you to renovate." She stepped further into the entryway, her eyes flicking toward Nora with open contempt. "This is beneath you, Matteo. Whatever this is, fire her. Come home. Let's finish what our families arranged before you embarrass us both any further." Nora felt the words land like a slap, but what surprised her more was watching Matteo's face as Valeria spoke. Not the flinch of a man caught, but a slow, deliberate hardening, the expression of someone finally seeing something clearly for the first time. "Our families arranged this marriage," Matteo said quietly, "because it was convenient, because it looked good on paper, because it consolidated territory and made the commission comfortable. I don't think either of us has ever pretended it was anything more than that." "That's how our world works," Valeria snapped. "Convenience is love, in families like ours. You know that better than anyone." "Maybe it used to be enough for me," Matteo said, and something in his voice made Nora's breath catch. "It isn't anymore." Valeria's expression flickered, the first genuine crack in her composure. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done, Valeria." He said it simply, without cruelty, but with a finality that filled the entire room. "The engagement is over." For a moment, the villa was utterly silent. Even the cicadas outside seemed to have paused. "You're ending this," Valeria said slowly. "For her?" She rounded on Nora with a fury that made Nora instinctively straighten, refusing to shrink beneath it, despite every instinct telling her to disappear into the wallpaper the way she once might have. "This obese little housemaid who scrubs your floors? Matteo, look at yourself. Look at what you're throwing away for someone who will never be able to stand beside you in the world we come from." "She's already stood beside me through more than you ever have," Matteo said, and he crossed the room to stand deliberately near Nora, close enough that the message was unmistakable. "She found the fraud that's been bleeding my accounts for over a year. She found who's behind it, before my own men did. She's risked her safety for a business that isn't even hers, for a family she owes nothing to. You've never once asked what I needed, Valeria." "Not in 3 years. Nora's asked me twice in 1 month, and actually listened to the answer." Valeria stared at him, something behind her fury cracking into genuine shock, as if the ground beneath a lifetime of careful arrangements had suddenly and irreversibly shifted. "You're going to destroy everything," she said, quieter now, almost a whisper. "Your family's alliance with mine, the commission's trust, everything your father built." "My father built a business on fear and cold transactions," Matteo said. "I'm not interested in inheriting that anymore. Not the marriage. Not the cruelty. None of it. You'll regret this," Valeria said, backing toward the door, her composure finally, completely gone. "When the commission hears you broke this engagement for a maid, when Silvio makes sure everyone hears it, let him," Matteo said. "I have nothing left to hide from either of you." Valeria left without another word, her heels sinking unevenly into the gravel as she stormed back to her car, and within minutes the vehicle was gone, disappearing down the same coastal road Silvio had vanished down days before. The villa fell silent again, the kind of silence that comes after something enormous has finally broken. Nora turned to Matteo slowly, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "You didn't have to say all of that." "I know," Matteo said, echoing the words she'd once said to him after Capri, and something in his expression softened into an emotion neither of them had dared to name directly until this moment. "I meant every word of it, Nora. I don't want the life I was building with her. I want the truth. I want the version of myself that exists when I'm with you, the one who isn't performing power for people who never earned my respect." Nora didn't trust herself to speak. She simply stood there, in the doorway of a crumbling villa on a Sicilian hillside, watching the last cold transaction of Matteo Conti's old life disappear down a dusty road, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 9 long years. "What happens now?" she finally asked. Matteo reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers, the first time he'd touched her without the pretense of business between them. "Now," he said quietly, "we finish exposing Silvio, and then we figure out the rest, together." The call came just after midnight, 3 days after Valeria's departure. One of Matteo's men, breathless, reporting movement at an old warehouse near the Messina docks that hadn't been used for legitimate shipping in over a decade. Silvio's car had been spotted there twice in the past week, always after dark, always gone before dawn. "He knows we're close," Matteo said, already pulling on his jacket. "He's covering his tracks." "The backup servers," Nora said, understanding immediately. She'd found the reference buried in an old maintenance contract 3 nights earlier, a climate-controlled storage unit within the Messina warehouse complex, installed nearly 2 years ago, officially for archived shipping records. At the time, it had seemed like nothing. Now it felt like the last thread holding their entire case together. If the original audit trails are stored there, the unaltered records, before Gianni's manipulation, that's the only physical proof we have that predates the frame-up. Everything else is reconstruction. If Silvio destroys those drives, then it's your word against his, and Valeria's already telling the commission I broke off an engagement for a housekeeper with a grudge. Matteo finished grimly. "We can't let that happen." They drove to Messina in silence, the coastal road a black ribbon beneath a moonless sky, both of them acutely aware that this was no longer a matter of careful audits and quiet suspicion. This was the moment the paper trail became something more dangerous. The warehouse sat at the edge of the docks, a hulking structure of corrugated metal and broken windows, abandoned enough to look forgotten and secure enough, Nora suspected, to hide exactly what Silvio needed hidden. Matteo's men waited outside per his instructions, watching the perimeter, while Matteo and Nora slipped through a side entrance he'd once used as a teenager, sneaking into his father's old properties before he understood what they truly were. Inside, the warehouse smelled of rust and stagnant seawater. Rows of empty shelving stretched into darkness, and at the far end, a faint industrial hum led them toward a reinforced door, the climate-controlled unit, exactly where the maintenance contract had promised. They found Silvio already inside. He stood in front of a bank of server racks, a fuel canister at his feet, his composed charm entirely absent for the first time since Nora had met him. What remained was colder, more desperate. A man who understood, finally, that the architecture he'd spent 14 months constructing was collapsing beneath him. "I should have known you two would find your way here eventually," Silvio said, not turning around immediately. "Persistent. Both of you." "It's over, Silvio," Matteo said, stepping further into the room, his voice low and dangerous in a way Nora had never heard from him before. "I know everything. The dead subsidiary, the Cayman account, The frame, Nora traced every euro. Did she? Silvio finally turned, and the smile he offered was thin, humorless, stripped of every ounce of the charm he'd worn like armor for years. Clever girl. I told her to leave while she had the chance. You threatened her, Matteo said. I warned her. Silvio's composure cracked further, something bitter and long buried surfacing beneath it. Your father promised me this territory would be mine one day, Matteo. 20 years I served this family. I raised you as much as he did, taught you everything you know about running this business, and when he died, the commission handed it all to you instead. A 26-year-old boy who'd never bled for any of it. I built the frame slowly, carefully, so that when it finally came apart, it would look like your own greed had destroyed you, and the commission would have no choice but to hand the territory to someone who actually deserved it. To you, Nora said quietly. To me, Silvio agreed. It would have worked perfectly if you'd simply stayed a housekeeper. He moved suddenly, kicking the fuel canister toward the server racks, and Nora understood with a jolt of pure adrenaline that he intended to burn everything, the drives, the evidence, the only proof that could clear Matteo's name. Don't, Matteo said, stepping forward. You want to stop me? Silvio's laugh was ragged, unhinged in a way that frightened Nora more than his earlier calm ever had. Go ahead, but you should know, the exits aren't as open as you think. He gestured toward the door they'd entered through, and Nora heard, faintly, the distinct sound of a heavy chain being drawn across metal from somewhere outside. I had that door secured the moment my men spotted your car on the coastal road. Enjoy the fire, Matteo. Consider it a mercy, compared to what the commission would have done to you if I'd let this play out properly. He struck a match. Nora's mind raced, adrenaline sharpening every detail of the room into sudden, desperate clarity. She'd spent the drive over studying the maintenance contract's building schematics on her phone, an old habit from years of auditing facilities she'd never physically seen. And she remembered, with sudden, vivid certainty, a secondary access point marked on the blueprint. A ventilation corridor, original to the building's decades-old refrigeration system, running along the eastern wall toward a service hatch that predated whatever security Silvio had arranged tonight. This way, she said, grabbing Matteo's arm and pulling him toward the eastern wall as Silvio dropped the lit match toward the fuel-soaked concrete behind them. There's a utility corridor. It should lead to a hatch near the loading dock. They ran as flames raced hungrily across the floor behind them, the heat blooming instantly against Nora's back. She found the service hatch exactly where the blueprint had promised, half hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit, and wrenched it open with strength she didn't know fear could give her. They scrambled through the narrow corridor, choking on smoke, until they burst out into the cold night air near the loading dock, Matteo's men rushing toward them the moment they emerged. Behind them, the warehouse was already engulfed, flames licking against the night sky, the servers Silvio had meant to destroy, now genuinely burning. But Nora, gasping for breath on the cold concrete, understood something Silvio hadn't accounted for. The hard drives, she said between coughs, pulling two scorched but intact external drives from beneath her jacket. The ones she'd yanked from the rack the instant she'd spotted the fire spreading, tucking them against her body as they'd run. I have them. Matteo, I have the originals. Matteo stared at her, soot-streaked and disbelieving, watching the warehouse burn behind them, and understood, with sudden, overwhelming clarity, that the woman standing beside him had just saved not only his life, but everything he had left to fight for. They didn't sleep for 4 days. The villa's study, once a quiet refuge for careful late-night conversations, transformed into something closer to a war room. Nora spread the recovered drives across the desk like fragments of a shattered mirror, each one holding a piece of the truth Silvio had tried to burn into ash. Matteo brought in a specialist he trusted, an old friend from his university years who now worked in digital forensics, sworn to silence with a debt Matteo had once done him the courtesy of never collecting on until now. Nora barely left the desk except to eat, and even then, she ate standing up, eyes still scanning printouts, her mind moving faster than her body could keep pace with. Matteo watched her work with something like awe, bringing her coffee she sometimes forgot to drink, draping a blanket over her shoulders on the second night, when she finally, briefly, fell asleep sitting upright in her chair. "You don't have to do all of this yourself," he told her quietly on the third night, finding her exactly where he'd left her hours earlier, dark circles deepening beneath her eyes. "Yes, I do," Nora said, not looking up from the spreadsheet she was building, a meticulous timeline stretching back 14 months. "Silvio didn't just steal from you, Matteo. He built a case designed to destroy you completely, to make the commission believe you're the kind of man who steals from his own family, who hides money while his people struggle. If I don't build something airtight, something no one can argue with, all of this was for nothing. He'll find another way to bury you, even from wherever they send him." "Nora," Matteo crouched beside her chair, gently closing his hand over hers, stilling the pen she'd been gripping too tightly. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, exhaustion and determination warring behind her eyes. "I know what you're carrying right now," he said quietly. "I know this isn't just about clearing my name for you. It's about proving, one more time, that you're not what people like Valeria, like that partner in Milan, decided you were. You don't have to prove anything to me. I already know exactly what you're capable of." Something in Nora's chest cracked open at that, an old wound she'd carried silently for years, finally acknowledged by someone who meant it. "I know," she said softly, "but I want to finish this anyway. Not for them. For me." Matteo nodded, understanding settling into something gentler, and simply stayed beside her the rest of the night, occasionally handing her documents, occasionally saying nothing at all, present in a way that asked nothing of her except her company. By the fourth night, Nora had built something extraordinary. A forensic report that reconstructed Silvio's scheme with devastating precision. Every misfiled invoice, every structured deposit beneath reporting thresholds. Every login timestamp connecting the offshore Cayman account not to Matteo, but to an IP address traced, through painstaking cross-referencing, directly to Silvio's private office in Naples during hours when Matteo had verifiable alibis. Dinners, meetings, a hospital visit for a sick employee that Silvio himself had insisted Matteo attend, apparently as cover. The final piece came from the recovered hard drives themselves, the original, unaltered shipping records from before Gianni's manipulation began, timestamps that proved definitively when the fraud had started and who had authorized the account restructuring that created it. "It's done," Nora said finally, in the pale gray light just before dawn, staring at the completed report with the particular hollow exhaustion of someone who had poured everything they had into a single piece of work. "It's airtight, Matteo. There's nothing here Silvio can explain away. Nothing the commission can dismiss as speculation." Matteo read through the report slowly, methodically, and Nora watched something profound move across his face as he absorbed the full scope of what she'd built, not just evidence, but a complete, undeniable narrative of betrayal, meticulously documented and impossible to refute. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were bright with something she hadn't expected. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of reverence. "Nora," he said quietly, "do you understand what you just did? You didn't just save my life. You saved this entire family's future. Every man who works for me, every legitimate contract I've built, every person who depends on this business, you saved all of it, with nothing but a pen and your mind, while a man twice your size tried to burn you alive to stop you. I had help," Nora said, exhaustion softening into something gentler. "You believed me from the very beginning, even when believing me meant suspecting your own cousin. I believed you," Matteo said, "because you were the only person in my entire life who never once asked me for anything in return for the truth." He reached for her hand, holding it with a tenderness that had nothing to do with the business between them anymore. "When this is over, when Silvio faces the commission, when this fraud is finally behind us, I don't want you to go back to being invisible, Nora. Not to me, not to anyone. You will never have to hide what you're capable of again. I promise you that." "What are you saying?" Nora asked softly, though some part of her already understood. "I'm saying I want you beside me," Matteo said. "Not as staff, not as someone who serves this family from the shadows. As an equal, a partner, in every sense of the word, in this business and in whatever comes after it." His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles, a small, quiet gesture that carried the weight of everything he hadn't yet found the courage to say fully. "You changed everything the moment you left that note under my coffee cup. I think some part of me has been falling for you since that very first morning, long before I understood what that feeling was." Nora's breath caught, 4 days of exhaustion dissolving beneath the weight of what he was offering her. Not just safety, not just vindication, but a future she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine years ago, in a cold office in Milan, where a man in a tailored suit had told her exactly what she wasn't worth. "Then let's finish this," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "Let's take this to the commission, Matteo. Let's finish it together." The syndicate commission met in a private estate on the outskirts of Rome, a neutral house belonging to no single family, chosen specifically for occasions when territorial disputes required the presence of every regional boss in the same room, without any one of them holding the advantage of home ground. Nora had never seen anything like it. A long marble hall lined with men who represented, collectively, more quiet power than most governments, seated around a table older than any of their family's claims to the businesses they now controlled. She stood slightly behind Matteo as he entered, dressed not as staff this time, but in a tailored navy suit Matteo had insisted on, carrying a leather folder that held 4 days of sleepless work compressed into 40 meticulously organized pages. Silvio was already seated when they arrived, composed once more, the desperate, unhinged man from the burning warehouse, replaced entirely by the practiced charm Nora remembered from their first encounter in the village market. He rose as Matteo entered, extending a hand as though nothing between them had changed. "Cousin," Silvio said warmly, for the benefit of the room, "I'm glad you finally decided to address this mess directly. The commission has been asking difficult questions about those Cayman accounts. I've done what I could to defend you in your absence, but I confess, the numbers looked troubling." Matteo didn't take his hand. "Sit down, Silvio. You'll want to hear this." A ripple of interest moved through the assembled elders, men who had known Matteo's father, who had watched Matteo inherit territory at 26 and quietly waited to see whether he would prove himself worthy of it or collapse under its weight. At the head of the table sat Don Alessandro Ferretti, eldest among them, a man whose word carried more weight in that room than any written law. "Matteo," Ferretti said, his voice weathered but sharp, "we've heard troubling accounts, structured deposits, an offshore account bearing your name. Silvio has expressed concern that you've been engaging in behavior that reflects poorly on this commission's trust in your leadership. And now rumors reach us that you broke off your engagement to the Ricci girl for—" His eyes flicked, briefly, dismissively, toward Nora, domestic staff. "Explain yourself." Matteo opened the leather folder and, without hesitation, without a trace of the defensiveness the room clearly expected, began laying documents across the table. 14 months ago, he said, his voice carrying the calm, methodical authority Nora had watched him build over months of sleepless nights. Someone inside my organization began systematically funneling money through a dissolved subsidiary, Meridian Holdings, into an offshore account bearing my name. An account I never opened, never accessed, and never knew existed until 6 weeks ago. This wasn't theft for personal gain. This was a deliberate frame, constructed with enough patience and precision to survive a federal investigation and destroy me completely. He laid out the forensic timeline Nora had built, page by page. The misfiled invoices, the structured deposits calibrated precisely to avoid reporting thresholds, the login timestamps tracing every access of the Cayman account back to a private office in Naples during hours that corresponded, without exception, to Silvio's verified presence and Matteo's verified absence. Silvio's composure held for the first 3 pages. By the 4th, Nora watched something behind his eyes begin to fracture. "This is fabricated," Silvio said, his voice sharper now, losing its earlier warmth. "Manufactured by a housekeeper with a personal agenda. A forensic auditor," Matteo corrected, "with 9 years of professional experience, whose findings have been independently verified by a digital forensic specialist whose credentials this commission can confirm within the hour, if anyone requires it." He gestured toward Nora, and for the first time since entering the hall, every eye in the room turned fully toward her. "This is Nora Bianchi. She uncovered this fraud on her first night in my household before she knew a single detail about my business. She traced every euro of it, while a man twice her size threatened her in a village market and later tried to burn her alive in a Messina warehouse to stop her from finishing this report." The room went utterly silent. "That's a serious accusation, Matteo," Ferretti said slowly, his eyes narrowing toward Silvio for the first time. "It's a documented one." Matteo pulled the final piece from the folder. Security footage timestamps from the Messina docks, cross-referenced against the fire department's incident report and Silvio's own vehicle registration, placing him at the warehouse the night it burned, hours before firefighters arrived to find 2 hard drives, the very drives now sitting on the table before the commission, mysteriously recovered from the wreckage. Ask him why he was at a warehouse that burned to the ground the same night the original, unaltered shipping records nearly went up in flames with it. Silvio said nothing. The silence stretched, damning in a way no words could have been. Ferretti studied the documents for a long, heavy moment, his weathered face unreadable, before he finally looked up, not at Matteo, but at Silvio, with the particular cold disappointment of a man who had trusted someone for 20 years and finally understood how thoroughly he'd been deceived. 20 years of service, Ferretti said quietly, and you tried to destroy your own family for territory that was never going to be yours. He turned to the other elders, exchanging brief, silent glances that carried decades of unspoken understanding between them. The commission has heard enough. What followed took less than 10 minutes. A verdict delivered not with violence, but with the quiet, absolute finality of men who had built their power on control rather than chaos. Silvio was stripped of his position, his authority, his standing within every family represented in that room, effective immediately. No blood was spilled, none was needed. The Commission's judgment alone was a sentence more permanent than any knife could have delivered. A man erased from the only world he'd ever belonged to. His 20 years of service reduced to nothing in the span of a single meeting. As Silvio was escorted from the hall, stripped of everything he'd tried to steal, Ferretti turned his attention one final time to Matteo, and then, deliberately, to Nora standing beside him. "You have unusual taste in staff, Matteo Conti," the old man said, something almost like respect flickering behind his weathered eyes. "See that you don't waste it." 6 months had passed since the Commission stripped Silvio of everything he'd spent 20 years building, and the Conti coastal estate no longer looked like the house Nora had first arrived at, with a single suitcase and nowhere else to go. The marble floors still gleamed, but the atmosphere that once hung over them, the particular tension of staff bracing for cruelty that could arrive without warning, had lifted entirely, replaced by something Nora still occasionally had to remind herself was real. Laughter drifted from the kitchens now. Enzo, who had once delivered Nora to a man determined to break her on her first morning, now greeted her every day with genuine warmth, treating her not as staff to be managed, but as the woman who had saved the family he'd served his entire life. Matteo had spent those 6 months dismantling everything Silvio had tried to protect. The illegal shipping routes, the falsified manifests, the entire shadow economy that had operated beneath the surface of the family's legitimate logistics business, all of it dissolved, piece by piece, with a thoroughness that surprised even the Commission elders who had once doubted whether a 26-year-old boy could ever fill his father's shoes. "You're certain about this?" Ferretti had asked him during one of the final calls to formalize the transition, converting fully, no shadow accounts, no arrangements held in reserve. "Most men in your position keep something back, just in case." "I've seen what those arrangements cost," Matteo had answered, with Nora sitting beside him at the study desk where all of this had truly begun. "I'm not interested in building a legacy on something that can be turned into a weapon against the people I love." Now, standing on the terrace overlooking the sea, as the estate filled with guests for the evening's gathering, Nora watched Matteo move through the crowd with an ease she'd never seen in him during those first cold weeks. No longer performing power for men who expected fear, but genuinely present among people he'd chosen to build a real business alongside. Legitimate contracts hung on the walls of his newly renovated offices now, framed beside the original shipping license his grandfather had filed decades ago, before ambition and desperation had pulled the family into darker waters. The mansion staff moved through the gathering with a different bearing entirely, no longer flinching at raised voices, no longer bracing for humiliation dressed up as correction. Matteo had quietly restructured wages across the entire household within his first month back from Rome, insisting on fair pay, reasonable hours, and a standing policy that no member of his staff would ever again be spoken to the way he'd once spoken to Nora on her first morning in this house. It was a small thing, in the scope of everything that had changed. It meant everything to the people who lived it. "You look like you're somewhere else," Matteo said, appearing beside her on the terrace, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He passed one to her, his fingers brushing hers with the easy familiarity of 6 months spent learning every quiet gesture of affection between them. "I was thinking about that first morning," Nora admitted, "how certain I was that I'd made a terrible mistake taking this job. I was a terrible mistake that morning, Matteo said, no defensiveness in the admission, only honesty. I've thought about it more than I probably should. How close I came to losing everything worth having, simply because I couldn't see past my own bitterness long enough to notice who was actually standing in front of me. You saw eventually, Nora said softly. Eventually, he agreed, was the smartest thing I ever did. He set his glass down on the stone railing and reached instead for her hand, holding it with the same tenderness he'd shown her in the villa study, the night he'd first called her his equal. Are you ready? Nora nodded, though her heart was pounding as they turned back toward the gathered crowd, the same elite circle that had once watched Valeria humiliate her in a Capri hotel suite, now assembled on this terrace for an announcement neither of them had rushed, but both of them had built toward with quiet, deliberate certainty. Matteo raised his glass, and the terrace slowly quieted, every eye turning toward the man who had spent the last 6 months transforming his family's legacy into something worth inheriting. 6 months ago, Matteo began, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. This family's business was built on fear, corruption, and a fraud that nearly destroyed everything my grandfather worked to create. Today, Conti Logistics is a fully legitimate global shipping company, the largest transformation this family has undergone in 3 generations. A ripple of applause moved through the gathering, but Matteo held up a hand, not finished. None of that would have happened without one person. A woman this family once treated as invisible, who found the courage to leave a €2 million discrepancy under my coffee cup on her very first morning here, and who spent the following months proving, again and again, that she was the most capable person in this entire business. He turned to Nora, and she felt every eye on the terrace shift toward her, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the old instinct to shrink beneath the attention. She felt, instead, exactly as visible as she deserved to be. I'm honored to announce Nora Bianchi as Chief Financial Officer of Conti Logistics, Matteo said, his voice steady with pride, overseeing every account, every ledger, every decision this company makes going forward. He paused, and something softer moved across his expression, private and unguarded, despite the audience surrounding them. And I'm even more honored to announce that she's agreed to be my partner in every sense of the word, in this business and in the rest of my life. The applause that followed was warm, genuine, entirely unlike the cold, calculated approval of Matteo's old world. And as Nora stood on the terrace beside the man who had once thrown papers at her feet and called her unfit to hold a broom, she understood that she hadn't just survived his cruelty. She had transformed it, one careful, unflinching truth at a time, into something neither of them could have imagined the morning it all began.